Mr. President, as you know, next week on April 20th, we will be marking the one-year anniversary of the Deepwater Horizon explosion, which killed 11 men. They are still in our thoughts and prayers and their families to this day, injured dozens of others, and shocked millions with the explosion that occurred a year ago next Wednesday. There are many steps that our nation has to take and must take to respond to that horrific incident, and Senator Vitter and I are on the floor today to introduce the Restore the Gulf Coast Act of 2011, which we believe is one of the most important things that needs to be done in response to this incident, and is frankly, Mr. President, long overdue even before this tragedy happened, and I'll briefly explain. This Gulf Coast is a very important coast of America. I know that all of our coasts believe, and it's true, they're all important, but we that live on the Gulf Coast are particularly proud of the coast of Texas and Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Florida, because on this coast, not only do we have the natural and normal port and maritime activities, which is true of every coast, we also support the nation in hosting a very important domestic oil and gas industry, which is primarily offshore, but a great deal onshore, both close and on our marshes. In addition, we have a very vibrant and robust fishing industry, both commercial and recreational. We have ecotourism, migratory bird routes from the south going north. Obviously, this is a highway for migratory birds and extremely important to wildlife enthusiasts and hunters and fishermen. And may I also add, and not let us forget, the tourism industry. So we say proudly in the Gulf Coast, we are America's working coast. We seek a balance between mining and exploring and using our natural resources and balancing that so that this coast can be sustainable. Mr. President, this is a great opportunity for the nation to do right by the Gulf Coast. It's a great opportunity for the polluters to step up and do the right thing. It's a great opportunity to give a break to taxpayers, because the bill that Senator Vitter and I are putting forward, and we hope our other colleagues will join us, will basically say that the fine that BP is going to pay, and maybe other contractors as well, that 80%, actually 100% of that fine should go, and at least 80% of that fine should go to this area where the injury occurred. I'm just going to take the next minute to put up this horrifying picture that people will remember, because a year ago, this is what the site looked like when the Deepwater Horizon exploded, and 5 million barrels of oil escaped from this tragedy and marred the beaches and marshes and oceans, and we're still recovering and will for years. But because of the 5 million approximate barrels that were spilled, this polluter, BP, and its contractors are going to have to pay a very serious fine to the federal government. We believe that that fine is best directed to help the environment which was injured, and to get the taxpayers off the hook and put the polluters on the hook for picking up this tab, and to do so in a way that's fair to the Gulf Coast states, and that is what Senator Vitter will speak about in more detail. Let me just show you one picture, happily. Today, the beaches along the Gulf Coast in large measure look like this. This is the way they normally look, because not only do we drill for oil and gas off of our waters, but our children swim in this water, we recreate and have picnics along the beach. This is the way we'd like this beach to look for decades to come. And if we're successful in getting our bill passed through the Congress and signed by the President in the near future, this is possible, along with pictures like this, which represent a great and proud industry, the shrimping industry in the Gulf Coast, which supplies fresh seafood for restaurants all over our nation and in some cases the world. So at this point, let me turn it to Senator Vitter for some more detail, and I want to just say it's been a pleasure, and I really thank him for his support. We want this to be a bipartisan effort. Both the industry and the environmental groups are very interested in working with us on this, and we think it's the right policy, Mr. President, for our country. Polluters should pay, not the taxpayer, and that the area that was injured should be the area that receives the response, and that the environment that was injured here should step up and be first attended to, and that is the essence and nature of our bill. But just to put a couple of other things in the record, Senator Vitter mentioned this, but it's worth repeating. President Obama has already endorsed this general concept, and I want to thank him for his early leadership on this and his administration. The Oil Spill Commission, which I had some real, I'll have to say, reservations about in the early stages of the makeup of that commission. I honestly didn't think that there were enough people representing the industry perspective, only the environmental perspective. I was happy to see that that commission report came out fairly balanced, and both Bob Graham, who was a former colleague of ours from Florida, and Bill Riley, the former EPA director under President Bush, came to the same conclusion that one of the best ways to spend this fine money would be restoring a very important coastal area, not just for the Gulf Coast, but for the nation and, frankly, the world, and to try to find a path forward for coastal communities to have sustainable economies. This is an important question, Mr. President, not just for the Gulf Coast, not just for the East Coast, not just for the West Coast, but I might say this might be one of the great questions in the world today. Since 60% of the population or more of the world, of the planet, live near coastlines, the question of how can people live there productively, safely, and how can that environment sustain them in that growth and development is a really important question to get answers to. And let me say, as a resident of the Gulf Coast, we don't have enough answers. We don't have enough money to ask questions. That's what this money will go for: some science and technology, some basic research, and most importantly, some money to restore and use the science we do have right now, even though we don't have enough, to do the right things by this environment. So I want to recognize those entities, and might I say, Secretary Mabus, who current Secretary of the Navy, took a leave or added to his portfolio to come and run this commission. And he, too, arrived at the same conclusion that a very excellent and smart way to spend some of these fine monies would be on these programs. Just a couple of minutes more to put some facts into the record, and other senators from other states, Florida, Texas, Mississippi, and Alabama, can enter their own data. But I just think it's important for people to understand when we talk about the coast of Louisiana, and Tanner, let's put this back up. Just the coast of Louisiana. This is going to be hard for people to believe, but it is actually true. The tidal miles, if you count the tidal miles of Louisiana, which is about 7,000 tidal miles, from the tip here all the way over to Texas, from our Mississippi border, 7,000 miles. If you stretched that out, it's the same as going from Miami to Seattle. Now, I just need people to get that in their mind. I know this looks like a little shore because it's not a big shore like California or New Jersey or whatever, Florida. But the nature of this shore, because it's not just a beach, it's America's greatest wetlands and marsh. If you stretched it out in all the inlets and bays and estuaries, it would go from Miami to Seattle. This area is threatened and has been for years. Yes, the oil and gas industry, unfortunately, has contributed to some of its damage, but it's also because the Mississippi River flows through here, and it's been dammed and tamed as best as men and women can try to tame natural things, and the hydraulics have changed, sea level has risen, And this area is under great threat. We lose 1,500 square miles have been lost since 1930, 25 square miles of wetlands each year, which means a football field every 30 seconds. This is an urgent matter. There is no loss of land anywhere in the continental United States that has this amount of threat to this coast. We have struggled for years to find a revenue stream to help fix it. We understand the rest of the country says, why should we fix it? It's not our coast. But what we say back is, this coast is important to the whole nation. It drains 40% of the continent. It's the greatest river system in North America. No one can get wheat out of Kansas or Iowa without coming through this Mississippi River, so there is an interest. 17% of the GDP is basically supported and created by this Gulf Coast economy. But we're also, Mr. President, willing to pay our own way as well. Our parishes have taxed themselves. The state has set up a constitutional safeguard, lockbox. If we'd only done that for Social Security, Mr. President, you would be happy. We've done a lockbox for the wetlands money that comes in, so it can only be used for that purpose. So we're very proud of the actions that our locals have taken. Now it's time for the federal government to act. A few more statistics and I'll end. 30% of the commercial fisheries in the United States comes off of this coast, and 1.7 billion in economic impact from recreational fishing, and again, over 50% of the domestic oil and gas, because we drill for oil and gas here that keep lights on and electricity in chambers like this in rooms and buildings all over our country. So that's why this is so important. I'm going to add some other statistics to the record about some of the economic impacts of this coast. But again, this is an important coast to the country, and it's an important effort for the world, for us in America to get this right. Just think about the drilling that's occurring off the coast of Africa or Brazil or Australia or Israel. And what happens? You know, let's prevent any explosions. Let's prevent these disasters, and we're struggling to do that, and the record is pretty good despite the criticism that comes, and that's a speech for another day. But the question is, when there's an accident, when this happens, how do you take that penalty money and invest it in the coast so that it's more resilient and it will really benefit people in every way over a long period of time in a very balanced fashion? I would only conclude by urging my colleagues along the Gulf Coast from Florida to Alabama to Mississippi and Texas, Republicans and Democrats alike, the members of the House as well, to step forward and join Senator Vitter and I. We're open to ideas and thoughts about how the money should be allocated, but within general sets of principles that we have outlined today. And I want to again thank Senator Boxer, whose committee will consider this in the very near future. We're hoping for a hearing in the very near future and then a markup on this bill to move it forward to the President's desk.